And just to mention, my funding comes from the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, so I'm eternally grateful that I can fund myself through the process. So I'm going to be looking at the non-cognitive development of children in early childhood, and specifically I'm looking at the influence of working mums, and does childcare usage play a mediating role? I'm very much aware that I'm probably in a room full of psychologists, and this slide here you could probably all discuss better than me, so I have to put it up to set the scene. But beyond that, I'll keep it brief. Certainly in economics, there has been a lot of literature, empirical evidence on cognitive skills, because they're easy to measure. So all our schools have various performance measures throughout the years, and we are able to determine how many factors might influence cognition. What has been a bit harder to capture until more recent years has been the non-cognitive skills. Now, by non-cognitive, we mean the kind of social and emotional skills that children and adults have. And one definition, which I've put up here, is a 5-factor model. There are a number of different definitions, and sometimes you see these in different forms. And this one kind of goes by the acronym of OCEAN. And these are the kind of personality traits that we all have to a greater or lesser extent. So the kind of areas that are important for non-cognitive development would be your agreeableness, how easy it is for you to get on with other people, or how difficult. Your extroversion, and by that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're kind of first on the dance floor and you're the most lively person in the room. It means how you can interact with people, your sociability, etc. Conscientiousness, your ability to apply yourself, your ability to plan for things, etc. Your openness to experience. Change is something that we all have to deal with in life, and some are more comfortable with it than others. And neuroticism really refers to your emotional stability. So your ability to maybe stay calm, or to manage all the variety of emotions that we have, not just throughout our lives, but certainly as a mother of 3 throughout the day. So keeping a calm head. So that's a very brief summary, and I'm sure you could put so many other words to these slides. So that's what I'm looking at, and we do know that these skills are hugely important to us in our lives as adults, and the development of these skills starts very, very early in childhood. And why economics might be particularly interested in this area, because certainly some people have been kind of surprised that you're an economist. This is your field. But Heckman has built a body of literature which is around the area of technology of skill formation, and his interest in this really came from the early childhood intervention programs like PFL that have when they first started looking at the effect of some of these programs, the cognitive aspects of our development were being looked at. And some of the research showed that really some of these programs, they're not having an impact. But when further research was actually developed, they realized, yes, they are. And they're having an impact on, for instance, people who've been grown up on these programs have lower crime levels, lower rates of smoking, antisocial behavior, pregnancy, even obesity, etc. So they found that the effect of a lot of these programs is actually channeled through the social and the emotional and behavioral type aspects of individuals. So specifically bringing it back to what this theory is about, this literature highlights the role of early environmental conditions in the evolution of cognitive and non-cognitive skills. So capabilities, our abilities, to put it into sort of economic speak, are produced by investments, so time, money, also by the environment within which we live, we operate, and our genes. And indeed, it's been shown that the environment can literally turn on and off or activate certain genes. The formation process has a number of developmental stages which actually start in vitro, or some would argue before, and periods where in early childhood have been seen to be quite sensitive as stages for development of these skills. So capabilities that you produce in one stage can then feed in to the next stage, such that in many ways the earlier you develop certain skills, the stronger those skills can be, because they're feeding into the development on the next stage and the next stage. Similarly, these capabilities are self-reinforcing and they're cross-fertilizing. In particular, non-cognitive skills can help the development of cognition. So they're hugely important in life. So my research question, specifically, given the data that I have, is does maternal employment in a child's first year influence the non-cognitive development of that child at the age of 3? And if so, well, why? What mediates that relationship? I'm using the Growing Up in Ireland data, and I'm using as my outcome measure is the strengths and difficulty score, which is measured at the age of 3. Now, this score was developed by Goodman almost 20 years ago, and the score that I'm looking at, the overall score, has 4 different categories of behaviour that are measured through a conversation with the mother or the primary caregiver. So certain questions are asked of her, and 5 boxes are ticked, and ultimately this score is derived. A high score, in Goodman's definition, a score over 17 is considered to be problematic. A score over 14 is considered to be borderline. So what I've decided to do, in particular because of the numbers involved, about 4.5% are actually, of my sample, are in the very high category, and I think it's about 7.5%, 7.1% are in this borderline category. I have them both together, and I'm saying that group are at risk of behavioural problems. So I've defined as my outcome measure the high score being greater or equal to 14. Okay. I have tested it, and a lot of what I find anyway also is relevant for just the very high group, the over 17 or 17 and over. So I'm using wonderful Irish data called Growing Up in Ireland. Probably everybody in this room knows it, and some know it extremely well, far better than me. There are 2 groups of children. There are the older children who were first surveyed at the age of 9, and I'm using the preschool children, and they were first surveyed, or not they, their parents were first surveyed when they were 9 months of age. I am using the first wave from 9 months, and I'm using the second wave, which was when they gathered when the children were 3 years of age. There is a third wave, which I'm dying to get my hands on, and it's from when the children were age 5. So that should be really, should enhance my paper, which is my second PhD paper, because we'll be able to learn so much more about these children when they start visiting school. So yes, so this research is based on 9 months and 3 years. So looking at these children, and what I'm quite interested in is, well, you know, mum's out of work, where are these children? So when these the children are 9 months of age, the GUI asks, you know, what kind of childcare arrangements do you have? So this chart is looking at, first of all, where are these children in terms of childcare, and bearing in mind an awful lot of mothers are still at home, so an awful lot of children are still not in the childcare system. And I'm also then looking at, well, okay, of those children who have high scores, high STQ scores, well, where are they? Okay, so blue pillars here tell me where are the children, and the red tell me, well, of the children who have high STQ scores, which indicate perhaps some level of behavioural problems, where are they? So this is not a regression, there's nothing controlled for, this is raw data. So what we're looking at here, I think this is going to, yeah, is 60% of the children at 9 months of age are at home with mum. They're not being cared for by anybody else. 15% are in informal care. Now, informal care refers to care in a home setting, so either in the child's own home or in a carer's home. That can be a nanny, it can be an au pair, it can be a family member, other than a grandparent, because there's some literature that shows that outcome measures differ when the care is provided by a grandparent. For that reason, grandparent care. I have 14% of these children at 9 months are actually being cared for by their grandparents, and 11% are in formal kind of creche type setting. Now you do find, these are 9 months, when you fast forward to the care setting at 3 years, there's more of a shift towards formal childcare. So for a variety of reasons, parents tend to favour or utilise more informal arrangements, in particular grandparent care, when the child is in their first year. So that's where they are. And as for those children that have high STQ scores, well, where are they at 9 months? We see here that proportionally speaking, more of these children are at home with their mothers, and slightly more than again are at home or in a home setting cared for by a grandparent. And just some of the data there, so this is quite small. This is just to give you an indication that there's a lot of heterogeneity here. You know, these groups are very, very different. So just looking that, gosh, you know, if you stay at home with your kid, they're going to have a hard time. That means nothing. It's just the demographics are actually different between these different groups, okay? So what we do find here, for those of you who can read it, I'm guessing at the back you probably can't. Here I'm looking at the average hours in childcare, and we find that those children who have long periods per week in childcare are largely in a creche setting. We also look at childcare being paid, and we do find that the vast majority of informal care is paid, but the majority of grandparents are not paid for their efforts. Their considerable efforts, I'm sure, for young children. We do find that in terms of maternal education, those who are utilising creches tend to be of a higher, the mother seems to have higher educational levels. Maternal depression is highest in mothers who are at home, and similarly the number of children, number of siblings for the child is greater for those who have a mother at home, which is understandable. We also find that the highest rate of single parents, single mothers, are utilising grandparent care. So, I mean, the story of the data is actually quite obvious. You know, we could probably guess at a lot of it ourselves. Behaviourally speaking, I have an indicator here, did you smoke while you're pregnant, to the mother? And we find that the lowest rate of smoking is for, during pregnancy, is for mothers who use a creche setting, creche care. And again, that's nothing to do with the care setting. It's completely to do with the mother and their background and their norms, etc. So, first regression that I've run is just to probe it, and what I'm looking at here is, does the work status of the mother influence in any way the STQ score, the behavioural score of the children? Primarily I'm looking at 9 months, but I've also put in 3 years as well. I'm looking at the mother being at home as the base case, part-time employment, full-time employment, and I'm also looking at there are mothers who describe themselves as their normal situation being at work, but they're not actually at work at the time of the survey. So I'm assuming that they're on leave, and most of them actually do go back to work. In fact, when they're surveyed at 9 months, a huge chunk of them go back, you know, 10, 11, 12 months when the child is about a year. So I have that for 9 months and 3 years, and I've used, you know, GUI has some wonderful data, and I've used a whole host of controls in my regression here. So I'm looking at parental stress, quality of attachment, ethnicity, maternal education, mother's health, child's health, birth characteristics. I have father's data in there as well. Slight complexity with the father's data in GUI because we have a lot of dads who have no survey information at all, either, you know, through the mother being a single parent, or the father's not responding to the survey, or though some of them who did, some of their data is still missing. So that's an area for further research. So looking at the results here, in economics, a certain amount of emphasis is placed on the education of a parent being beneficial in, say, things like health production. So I've decided to split my data by, okay, those mums who don't have post-secondary school education and those that do. Because when I look at the data as a whole, I'm not getting a huge amount of information from it, but I know that, you know, my data has subgroups that are very, very different. So I've decided to use as a marker education, maternal education, to split my group. because disadvantage can come in many forms, and education or lack of education in the home would be one of those. So what I have here is the results for the whole group. Then I split by low and I split by high. Okay? So what I find is, in terms of significance for working at 9 months, does it have an influence on the behavioural scores of the children at 3 years of age? Well, I don't get any noise here, no stars. So there's not really much of a story there at high level. But then when I start to split and I look at my group of those children who have mothers with lower levels of education, well, I do find full-time employment increases the SDQ score, or can influence the SDQ score by about 5%. These are marginal effects probit, which is quite high, significant at 10%. For the low maternal education. And for high maternal education, I'm finding that employment at 9 months really doesn't seem to matter. These families seem to be able to cope quite well with whatever circumstances they're in. Interestingly again, when I look at the maternal work status at 3 years, I do find that there are beneficial effects of part-time and full-time employment on the SDQ score of these young children. So this is actually consistent with the literature. The literature tends to tell you that, when you return to work really does matter. And that first year seems to be a very sensitive period. Going back to the Heckman theory on skill formation, is a sensitive period in skill formation. So returning to work, or being at work, not necessarily returning to work, when the child is 3 years of age, for the vulnerable group here, as identified above, doesn't seem to be a problem. It seems to be beneficial. Now that can be through the introduction of greater resources perhaps into the household as well. But we could certainly debate why that might be. So again, in the literature and in conferences, one of the big things that's thrown at you is, well, hang on a second, selection bias. These mothers, it's not about the working. These mothers are actually different to mothers who are working differ to those who stay at home. And it's not the act of going out to work that makes any difference to the children. It's actually the fact that they perhaps have traits that differ between that also determine whether they work and can influence their development, the child development. So perhaps the mother has higher ability, or perhaps she's less maternal and she goes out to work. Also, perhaps those traits are unmeasured. We can't measure them. We can't identify them. So, the criticism often leveled at results like this are, well, actually, the effect you're getting from maternal employment encompasses other things that's unmeasured. So it's not actually going out to work. So what I've done is I've used propensity score matching to address selection bias. I've also then used a methodology to try and to assess, well, not measure selection bias, but to say, well, if I had a certain amount of selection bias, how much selection bias would it take for my whole results to be consumed by selection bias, and to basically say I have no effect from maternal employment. So I've used matching. I had the indicator for 5 minutes shown to me a few minutes ago. Can I? Okay. Well, I'm going to go through this very briefly because I know Katrina is going to do some on this later on. So really what matching does is we have observational data. We don't have a clinical kind of experimental setting. So we're trying to, in some way, mimic this more clinical experimental setting. So what we do is we use matching. So we have our treatment group and we construct a comparison group. We have to have certain assumptions. And the key assumptions here are that all relevant differences between the treatment and the non-treated are captured in their observable attributes. So we're basically saying we've got one group here, the treatment, the others are the control group. They're pretty much identical in every way, or most ways, except the only thing that if you measure is that's be different between the outcome is the effect of the treatment. Okay, and observed participants and non-participants have same characteristics, and they're in an area of common support. So we use the observed mean outcome of the non-treated estimate to measure the effect of the treatment on the treated. So you basically say if the treated people were not treated, they would look like this comparison group here. And the difference between the two of them, hey presto, is the effect of your treatment. And in my research here, my treatment would be employment, maternal employment. However, because I've got loads of different variables, as the list showed earlier, I'm going to use a balancing score which takes in a whole load of these variables and comes up with a probability for the mother to be in employment and matched based on the propensity score. So the probability of participating in a treatment, given the observed characteristics, the covariates, is what I'm matching on. It acts as a balancing score, and I can use to do that estimation either a Probit or a Logit model, and I chose to use a Probit largely because it tends to be what's used in the economics literature. There are three choices of matching estimators that you can use, or three summarized categories of matching estimators, and by that I mean is, you have your treatment group, you have your control group. I have a number of ways that I can match the two of them and find out the difference between the two being the treatment. I can say, for instance, in this particular example here, the treatment child is matched to all the children in the control group who are within a particular area of the propensity score. So if this, the treatment person or child has a probability of being in the treatment group of 50%, 0.5, I'm looking at similar children in and around that area of 0.5 as well. And I'm matching the two of them. I can impose different tolerance levels or distances, and that's what I do. And it's important to do all of this because you don't want your results to be down to the fact that you've chosen a particular type of estimator. These are just to facilitate you understanding the treatment effect, not to provide you with a treatment effect that you want. So I did radius caliper matching. I also did nearest neighbour matching. As the neighbour, as the title says, you quite literally say, okay, I have a child who's received the treatment. I have a child who hasn't received the treatment, but their probability of getting that treatment based on all their characteristics are very close. So bang, bang, I match the two, and the difference is the effect of the treatment. You can do that by selecting a particular control child, or you can do it and take that control child out of the equation such that it cannot be used as a match for any other in the treatment group, which is called without replacement, or you can do it with replacement. Generally, with replacement gives better results in terms of matching variance because you're allowing better matches. So I did various configurations of that, as you'll see. And finally, something which Katrina is going to talk about later, you can do kernel density estimation, which matches each student to a weighted average of all observations in the comparison group. And I'm not going to go into that since I'm not going to steal your thunder, but anyway, so to maybe get to the punchline. So I chose, just because it seemed to be fairly, a good representation of most of the techniques, radius caliper matching with a caliper at distance of 0.01. Now, looking at the actual results here, so really what I'm saying, I found an effect when I used my ordinary regression. Does that withstand propensity score or a matching estimation? Now, matching is by no means perfect, or it won't catch unobserved characteristics that I don't have in my characteristics. But, it goes some way towards addressing some of the parametric problems of Probit or OLS. So we did find here, again, we can have a look at, this is low maternal education, high maternal education, and the effect on the probability of a high STQ score, i.e. a problematic score. And I do find is that full-time employment versus being at home, we saw for Probit increases, and for propensity score matching also increases. It does survive the matching process, the probability of a child having a high STQ score for children of mothers with low levels of education. Part-time doesn't survive, and I looked at full-time versus part-time and found no effects there as well. So as I said, you can only assume that no endogeneity if selection is on observables, i.e. things that we can measure, this can give us the true result. If we still have unobservables that are unmeasured and they are not balanced between treatment and control, well then, this doesn't really address the problem. So I'm fully aware of the issue. So, finally, I wanted to measure what it would take for my results to actually be consumed or lost due to selection bias. And I used this particular measure first used by I never pronounce his name right. I'm sure there's somebody in the room who knows. Al-Tunji and colleagues about 15 years ago. And they're saying, look, how large must the selection bias be to basically invalidate your results? You can't measure your selection bias because we're not even quite sure that it's there. But it's basically saying, all right, you found your result. What would it take for these unobservables to actually, rule out that you have any real effect? So I did this, and I won't go through the nitty-gritty of it. If anybody wants to talk to me about the methodology afterwards, please do. Another table for you. And just looking at what's in red here, full-time employment at home, or full-time employment versus mothers who are at home for those in the low educational group. And again, I don't have time to go through how these are calculated, but what minus sign basically says that you can ultimately say that the result that we have found here means that the figure for the low education sample, the effect of full-time maternal employment is at least the size that I found. So it could actually be somewhat bigger. So we're ultimately saying that some of these mothers have skills that seem to counteract the effect of maternal employment. Okay? And if anybody wants to discuss that, these methodologies, I'll be happy to chat about it later. I also looked at the mediating role of a number of factors, i.e. we know there's effect now for this group. What's causing that? So I looked at, childcare. I looked at income. Is it money? Is it household resources? Is it stress? Going out to work and juggling all that goes with it can be very stressful. Is that impacting the child? And I also looked at the attachment between the mother and the child, the scores on that. And I found, so who is at risk? Children with mothers with low levels of education, cared for in infancy, here's the punchline, by grandparents, in particular grandparents who are unpaid. The scores that are influenced by this care are hyperactivity. So remember we saw the 4 categories that make up the STQ score. So the hyperactivity scores seem to be elevated for children who are looked after by grandparents, and in particular the effect is there for grandparents who are not paid for their efforts. Now we could have a good interesting chat as to why that might be. Maybe these parents are these grandparents are put upon, maybe they're less physically able to look after young children, maybe they have low levels of education because the mothers of these children have lower levels of education, so the chances of these being from a low education background and not really being equipped to develop the skills of these children are probably quite high. And yeah, maybe they are unwilling carers. They are not paid for their efforts. Over half of the just slightly over half of the grandparents are not paid. Now, plenty are, but over half are not. From a policy implications perspective, affordability is a big problem for childcare in Ireland. Anybody who has children will know this only too well. But if you are from a background with very limited resources, your childcare options are very much limited. So 22% of mothers with low levels of maternal education state that their choice of childcare is determined by financial constraints, compared to 12% of those with higher levels of education. So 1 in 5 of this group are saying, I don't really have a huge choice of childcare because my budget is limited. We could also say, grandparents do provide a necessary role, but they are completely unsupported, certainly in any sort of structured way. So maybe there's a role in policy terms to actually support them. Perhaps there could be greater links between those grandparents who were providing childcare and more formal structures in terms of giving them respite or just some limited training in what they would need to do. And also, is there an argument to allow these mothers to stay at home for longer than they currently are? On average, a lot of these women who do return to work are returning to work earlier than mothers from higher SES backgrounds, albeit there are fewer of them in the workforce. Those who are in the workforce are returning to work quite early. And that is me done. And so if you have any questions, please do shout.